September 19th, 1944. Dawn. The rolling farmland east of Arracourt, Lorraine, France. Oberst Hans von Luttwitz stood in the cupola of his Panther tank, watching the morning mist burn off the wheat fields. Behind him stretched the 5th Panzer Army's 113th Panzer Brigade, freshly equipped, fully fueled, and ready for what Berlin promised would be a devastating counteroffensive. Von Luttwitz had every reason for confidence. His Panthers mounted the 75mm KWK-42 gun, the finest tank weapon in the world. Their frontal armor was 80mm thick, sloped at 55 degrees. The mathematics were simple. American Sherman tanks couldn't penetrate that armor at combat range. He had read the intelligence briefings. He knew what he would face. The Americans were equipped with M4 Shermans, 30-ton machines with 75mm guns that German tankers called Ronsons because they lit up on the first strike. The reports from Normandy had been consistent. Shermans died easily. A single Panther could destroy 5, 6, sometimes 7 Shermans before being knocked out. The Americans won through numbers, through overwhelming material superiority, but never through quality. Von Luttwitz believed this completely. He had the data to support it. German gunnery tables proved that a Sherman's 75mm gun firing standard armor-piercing rounds could not penetrate a Panther's glacis plate at any combat distance. The Americans would have to flank, to expose themselves, to die trying. His orders were explicit. Drive west toward Lunéville. Crush the American Third Army's spearhead. Cut their fuel supplies. Force Patton to halt his advance toward the German border. But Oberst von Luttwitz was making a fatal assumption. He believed he understood what he would face. He had studied the reports from Normandy, analyzed the tank-to-tank kill ratios, absorbed the narrative that German armor was qualitatively superior. What he didn't know, what German intelligence had failed to grasp, was that the Americans had changed the rules. They weren't planning to fight Panthers with Shermans. They had brought something else entirely. In the silence of war, countless stories were almost forgotten. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Silent Battlefield and help keep their memory alive. The German confidence in September 1944 was not irrational. It was based on mathematical reality and combat experience. The Panther tank was arguably the finest medium tank of World War II. Introduced in the summer of 1943 after the disaster at Kursk, the Panther combined mobility, firepower, and protection in ways that Allied tanks could not match. The 75mm KWK-42L/70 gun could penetrate 140mm of armor at 1,000 meters. The sloped frontal armor was equivalent to approximately 140mm of vertical steel. American tankers in Normandy had learned the hard way that shooting at a Panther from the front was suicide. The rounds simply bounced off. The Sherman, by contrast, was a compromised design. It had been built for reliability, ease of manufacture, and strategic mobility. The M4 with the standard 75mm gun could penetrate only about 90mm of armor at 500 meters. Against a Panther's frontal armor, that wasn't enough. Sherman crews had to aim for the sides or rear, vulnerable spots that meant closing to point-blank range or executing dangerous flanking maneuvers. German tactical doctrine reinforced this advantage. Panzer units were trained to engage at long range, using superior optics and guns to destroy enemy tanks before they could close the distance. In the bocage country of Normandy, this advantage had been partially negated by terrain. The hedgerows forced close-range ambushes where German armor superiority mattered less. But here in Lorraine, the terrain was different. These were open fields, gentle hills, clear lines of sight extending for thousands of meters. This was killing ground for Panthers. Von Luttwitz knew all of this. So did his crews. They had trained on these machines for months. They understood ballistics, the penetration tables, the tactical employment. When they rolled toward Arracourt on the morning of September 19th, they were not being arrogant. They were following established doctrine based on verified combat performance. But there was information they didn't have. American doctrine was evolving. The U.S. Army had learned from Normandy. They knew their Shermans were outmatched in tank-versus-tank combat. So they had developed a solution. They called it the Tank Destroyer Doctrine. The Americans had created specialized units equipped with vehicles designed for one purpose: killing enemy tanks. These weren't tanks. They were hunters. The M18 Hellcat and the M36 Jackson were fast, lightly armored, and armed with guns that could defeat German armor at ranges where Panthers felt safe. The M18 Hellcat was the fastest tracked combat vehicle of the war. Could reach 55 miles per hour on roads. Its 76mm gun, firing high-velocity armor-piercing rounds, could penetrate a Panther's side armor at 1,500 meters. The M36 Jackson mounted a 90mm gun, the same weapon used on American heavy anti-aircraft artillery, repurposed to destroy tanks. That 90mm gun could penetrate 180 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. Could go through a Panther's frontal armor. These tank destroyers operated under different tactical principles than tanks. They didn't hold ground. They didn't slug it out toe-to-toe. They used speed and positioning to ambush enemy armor, fire from concealment, then relocate before German guns could respond. American Doctrine called it shoot and scoot. The Germans called it cowardice. But it worked. At Arracourt, the Americans had deployed the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. This unit was equipped with M18 Hellcats. They had also brought forward elements of other tank destroyer battalions with M36 Jacksons. These units were attached to the 4th Armored Division, one of Patton's most experienced and aggressive formations. The American tankers and tank destroyer crews knew the math just as well as von Luttwitz did. They knew that a Sherman against a Panther was a losing fight. So they didn't fight that way. They let the tank destroyers do the killing while Shermans provided support, suppressed infantry, and exploited breakthroughs. German intelligence had observed tank destroyers in Normandy, but the reports were incomplete. The Germans knew these vehicles existed, but they didn't fully understand their tactical employment or their prevalence in American armored formations. German after-action reports tended to classify all American armored vehicles as tanks. This linguistic imprecision created a false impression that the Americans were simply throwing more Shermans into battle. Von Luttwitz briefings had mentioned American tank destroyers, but the emphasis had been on the Sherman threat. The intelligence officers told him he would face large numbers of M4 tanks supported by infantry. The tank destroyers were described as a specialized unit, not as the primary anti-armor force. This was a critical misunderstanding. On the morning of September 19th, the 113th Panzer Brigade advanced with approximately 75 Panthers and a battalion of Panzer IV tanks. They moved in column formation along the roads, expecting to encounter American forces in the vicinity of Arracourt. The weather was clear. Visibility was excellent. Von Luttwitz could see for kilometers across the gently rolling farmland. At approximately 9 a.m., lead elements of the German column spotted American vehicles in the distance. The Panthers deployed from march column into battle formation. Commanders scanned the horizon through their optics. They identified Shermans. The German gunners began ranging their targets. What they didn't see were the 5 M18 Hellcats positioned in hull-down firing positions on a ridgeline 1,200 meters to the south. The Hellcats were concealed behind farm buildings and tree lines. Only their turrets were visible and barely that. The American tank destroyer crews had positioned themselves perfectly. They had clear fields of fire across the German axis of advance, but the Panthers hadn't spotted them yet. The M18 commanders watched through their periscopes as the Panthers maneuvered into position. They waited. Tank destroyer doctrine emphasized patience. You didn't fire until you had a clean shot and an escape route planned. The Hellcat crews had both. At 9:14 a.m., the lead Hellcat fired. The 76mm gun cracked across the fields. The armor-piercing round covered the distance in less than 2 seconds. It struck a Panther in the side armor, just forward of the turret ring. The penetration was catastrophic. The round punched through the 40mm side plate, entered the crew compartment, and detonated ammunition. The Panther exploded. The turret separated from the hull and landed 15 meters away. The other 4 Hellcats opened fire in rapid succession. 5 Panthers were burning within 30 seconds. The German column dissolved into chaos. Commanders tried to locate the source of the fire, but the tank destroyers were partially concealed and the morning sun was in German eyes. Panthers began maneuvering, trying to present their frontal armor toward the threat. But they didn't know exactly where the threat was. The Hellcats fired again. More Panthers died. The American crews were trained to aim for weak points. The sides, the rear, the lower hull where armor was thinner. At this range, their guns were lethal. The 76mm HVAP rounds, high-velocity armor-piercing, were tearing through German steel like it was tin. Von Luttwitz radioed for his Panthers to fall back and regroup. The American tank destroyers had achieved complete surprise. Within minutes, the Germans had lost over a dozen tanks without scoring a single kill. The survivors retreated behind a tree line to reassess. This was the moment when von Luttwitz's assumptions began to crack. He had expected to face Shermans. He had expected a fight where German guns outranged American guns, where German armor held against American shells. What he had encountered instead was something different. These American vehicles were fast, well-positioned, and armed with guns that could kill Panthers at ranges where Panthers couldn't effectively return fire because the targets were concealed. But von Luttwitz didn't panic. He was a professional. He adjusted his tactics. He ordered his Panthers to advance in dispersed formation, using terrain for cover. He called for artillery support to suppress the American positions. He directed reconnaissance elements to locate the enemy vehicles and identify their numbers. The problem was time. The Americans weren't stationary. By the time German artillery began falling on the ridgeline where the Hellcats had been positioned, the tank destroyers were gone. They had displaced to alternate firing positions 800 meters to the west. The M18 speed allowed them to relocate in minutes. When the Panthers resumed their advance, the Hellcats opened fire again from a completely different angle. This pattern repeated throughout the morning. The German armor would advance, encounter devastating fire from concealed positions, take losses, regroup, and advance again. Each time, the American tank destroyers had moved. The Germans were fighting ghosts. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion's after-action report for September 19 recorded 21 confirmed kills against German armor for the loss of 0 tank destroyers. The Americans had fought a nearly perfect defensive action. They had used terrain, mobility, and superior situational awareness to negate every advantage the Panther possessed. By midday, von Luttwitz faced a decision. His brigade had lost over 30 tanks. His advance had been stopped cold. His men were demoralized. The American positions around Arracourt had not been broken. Worse, German fuel supplies were running low. The advance had consumed more fuel than planned because of the constant maneuvering under fire. He ordered a withdrawal to regroup and await reinforcements. The 113th Panzer Brigade pulled back to positions east of Aricort. That evening, von Luttwitz wrote his after-action report. He described encountering unexpectedly strong American tank forces equipped with high-velocity guns. He noted that American tactics emphasized mobility and ambush rather than positional defense. He recommended that future attacks should include stronger artillery preparation and better reconnaissance. But there was something he didn't write, something that would take days to fully acknowledge. The assumption that German armor was qualitatively superior had been proven false. Not because the Panther was a bad tank, it wasn't, but because the Americans had changed the nature of the fight. They had stopped trying to beat Panthers with Shermans. They had brought tank destroyers instead, vehicles specifically designed to kill German armor, and they had employed them in ways that German doctrine hadn't anticipated. The battle for Arracourt would continue for another week. The Germans would launch multiple attacks, bringing in additional panzer brigades including the 111th Panzer Brigade with more Panthers and the famous 15th Panzergrenadier Division. They would commit over 200 tanks to the offensive. They would all fail. The pattern established on September 19th repeated with brutal consistency. German armor would advance. American tank destroyers would engage from concealed positions at ranges where their guns were effective. Panthers would burn. The Germans would withdraw, regroup, and attack again. The cycle continued until German fuel and replacement tanks ran out. By September 29th, the German counteroffensive had collapsed. The 113th Panzer Brigade had been effectively destroyed. The 111th had suffered massive losses. German reports estimated that over 100 panzers had been knocked out around Aricort. American losses were minimal, approximately 25 Shermans and a handful of tank destroyers. The kill ratio was catastrophic for Germany. In Normandy, German armor had often achieved favorable exchange rates despite being outnumbered. At Arracourt, the opposite occurred. American tank destroyer battalions achieved kill ratios of 10 to 1 or better. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion alone claimed 39 enemy tanks destroyed during the week-long battle. Oberst von Luttwitz survived the battle. He was reassigned. His brigade was disbanded due to losses and the survivors were absorbed into other formations. He would continue fighting until the end of the war, but he never forgot Aricort. In post-war interviews, he acknowledged that the battle had revealed fundamental flaws in German tactical assumptions about American armor capabilities. The Germans had believed that superior tank design would overcome American numerical advantage. What they learned at Arracourt was that the Americans didn't need better tanks. They needed better tactics and specialized vehicles employed correctly. The tank destroyer doctrine, which many American officers had criticized as inefficient, had proven devastatingly effective when properly executed. The Battle of Arracourt remained relatively unknown for decades. It was overshadowed by larger operations like Market Garden and the Battle of the Bulge. But military historians recognize it as one of the most lopsided armored victories of the war. It demonstrated that technological superiority in one system, the Panther tank, could be negated by tactical flexibility and combined arms integration. World War II is not just history. It is life, pain, and sacrifice. Subscribe to Silent Battlefield to honor those who lived, suffered, and were lost. The American tank destroyer doctrine had been controversial from its inception. The concept emerged in 1941 when American military planners, studying German blitzkrieg tactics, concluded that mass tank formations posed the greatest threat to defensive positions. They decided to create specialized anti-tank units that could rapidly concentrate against enemy armor breakthroughs. The tank destroyer branch was established as a separate organization from both the infantry and the armored forces. This created institutional tensions. Armor officers argued that tanks should fight tanks. They believed that creating a separate tank destroyer force diluted the armored divisions and resulted in inefficient allocation of resources. The tank destroyer advocates countered that tanks were meant to exploit breakthroughs, not to engage in attrition battles with enemy armor. They argued that specialized vehicles with high-velocity guns and superior mobility could engage enemy tanks more effectively than medium tanks carrying additional armor and lower-velocity weapons. The debate continued throughout the war. In Normandy, tank destroyer battalions had mixed results. In some engagements, they performed brilliantly. In others, they were misemployed as stationary artillery or assigned to infantry support roles where their mobility was wasted. The doctrine required aggressive commanders who understood how to use speed and positioning rather than armor for protection. At Arracourt, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel George Davidson. He was a proponent of aggressive tank destroyer tactics. He had trained his battalion to operate in small, highly mobile teams that could displace rapidly after engaging targets. His crews practiced firing a limited number of rounds, usually 3 to 5, before relocating to alternate positions. This shoot and scoot methodology was designed to prevent German artillery from bracketing American positions. In previous battles, stationary American tank destroyers had been vulnerable to German counter-battery fire. The long-range German 88mm guns could destroy a Hellcat with a single hit, and the thin armor on American tank destroyers offered no protection. Mobility was survival. Davidson also emphasized intelligence and reconnaissance. His forward observers identified German assembly areas and approach routes before the battles began. When the Panthers advanced, the tank destroyer crews already knew where to position themselves for optimal fields of fire. This preparation was crucial to the success at Arracourt. The terrain around Arracourt favored the defenders. The area consisted of gently rolling hills with scattered farms, woodlets, and stone walls. The elevation changes were subtle, but they provided excellent hull-down positions where a tank destroyer could conceal its lower hull while exposing only its turret. From these positions, the Hellcats could observe approaching German armor at distances exceeding 2,000 meters. The Americans also benefited from air superiority. By September 1944, the Luftwaffe was largely absent from the skies over France. American P-47 Thunderbolts provided close air support and reconnaissance. They identified German columns moving toward the battlefield and attacked supply vehicles, further degrading German mobility. The Panthers that reached Arracourt were often low on fuel and forced to conserve ammunition. German commanders understood these disadvantages, but they had no choice except to attack. The strategic situation demanded it. Patton's Third Army was approaching the German border. If the Americans broke through into the industrial Saar region, Germany's war production would be crippled. Hitler had personally ordered the 5th Panzer Army to attack and destroy the American spearheads. The orders from Berlin reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of the battlefield reality. Hitler and his staff believed that German armor was still qualitatively superior to anything the Americans fielded. They assumed that aggressive panzer attacks would shatter American formations just as they had shattered French and British forces in 1940. The strategic calculus was based on outdated information. German tank production in September 1944 was impressive. Factories were still producing approximately 300 Panthers per month despite Allied bombing. But pilot training had collapsed. Experienced Panzer commanders were dead or reassigned to desperate defensive battles in the east. The crews arriving at Aricort were often poorly trained replacements with limited combat experience. In contrast, the American 4th Armored Division was one of the most experienced formations in Patton's army. They had fought across France since the Normandy breakout. Their tank crews and tank destroyer teams had developed effective combined arms tactics through hard-won experience. They knew how to coordinate infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. They knew how to fight. On September 20th, the Germans attacked again. This time they tried a different approach. Instead of advancing in broad daylight across open ground, they moved in the pre-dawn darkness, hoping to close the distance before American tank destroyers could engage. The 113th Panzer Brigade, reinforced with elements of the 111th, launched a coordinated assault toward American positions south of Arracourt. The attack initially achieved surprise. German Panthers penetrated the American forward positions and destroyed several Shermans in close-range fighting. For a few hours, it seemed the German tactics had finally succeeded. But as dawn broke and visibility improved, the American tank destroyers counterattacked. The Hellcats came from multiple directions, using their speed to flank the German penetration. They engaged Panthers from the sides and rear, the vulnerable points where armor was thinnest. The German tanks, designed for frontal engagements, found themselves fighting a 360-degree battle. Panthers began dying again. By mid-morning, the German attack had stalled. The lead elements were surrounded. The follow-on forces couldn't advance because American artillery had zeroed in on the approach routes. German commanders realized they were losing more tanks trying to support the initial assault than the assault had destroyed. They ordered another withdrawal. This attack cost the Germans an additional 30 tanks. American losses were fewer than 10 vehicles. The pattern was becoming clear. No matter how the Germans attacked, daylight or darkness, concentrated or dispersed, the result was the same. American tank destroyers and combined arms tactics were systematically destroying German armor. After September 20th, German commanders began questioning the viability of continuing the offensive. Fuel stocks were critically low. Replacement tanks were arriving slowly. The few replacement crews were arriving with minimal training. Morale was deteriorating. Panzer crews who had believed in German technological superiority were now facing a battlefield where their advantages had evaporated. One German tanker, whose account was recorded in divisional histories, described the psychological impact. "We were told the Panthers were invincible. We were told American tanks were inferior. Then we watched our best tanks burn from guns we couldn't see. We advanced across open ground and died. We attacked at night and died. Every tactic failed. We began to understand that we were not winning. We were being destroyed." The Battle of Arracourt continued through late September. The Germans launched several more attacks, each smaller and less coordinated than the last. By September 29th, the offensive had completely collapsed. German forces withdrew to defensive positions. They would not attempt another major armored offensive in Lorraine. The strategic consequences were significant. Patton's Third Army maintained its positions and continued pressing toward the German border. The 5th Panzer Army, which had been assembled to throw the Americans back, had been shattered. Over 100 panzers had been destroyed for minimal American losses. Germany could not afford such exchange rates. The tactical lessons were equally important. The battle demonstrated that technological superiority in individual weapon systems was insufficient without proper tactical doctrine and trained crews. The Panther was still an excellent tank, but it couldn't win battles by itself. The Americans had developed a system, tank destroyers, combined arms coordination, air superiority, artillery support that negated German advantages. German military intelligence finally began filing accurate reports about American tank destroyer units. Post-war analysis revealed that German commanders had consistently underestimated both the capabilities and the prevalence of these vehicles. By late 1944, nearly every American armored division included attached tank destroyer battalions, but German order of battle assessments often failed to account for them. The failure to understand American tactical evolution was systemic. German intelligence focused on counting enemy tanks and comparing specifications. They produced detailed analyses of Sherman armor thickness and gun performance. But they missed the larger picture. The Americans weren't trying to win tank versus tank duels. They were fighting combined arms battles where specialized vehicles performed specialized roles. The men of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion were never awarded the recognition their performance deserved. The battalion received a Distinguished Unit Citation for its actions at Arracourt, but individual awards were limited. Many of the crews rotated back to the United States after the war and returned to civilian life without fanfare. Their contribution to the defeat of the 5th Panzer Army remained largely unknown outside military circles. Lieutenant Colonel Davidson continued commanding tank destroyer units through the end of the war. In post-war writings, he argued that Aricort had proven the validity of the tank destroyer concept. He noted that the battle had been won not through superior armor but through superior tactics, positioning, and crew training. His reports influenced American armor doctrine in the early Cold War period. The American M-18 Hellcat and M-36 Jackson tank destroyers remained in service through the end of World War II. They fought in the Battle of the Bulge, where they again demonstrated their effectiveness against German armor. They participated in the final drive into Germany in 1945. After the war, most were scrapped or sold to Allied nations. A few survive in museums today, preserved as examples of a vehicle type that proved its worth but was quickly made obsolete by post-war developments. The Panther tank continued serving in diminishing numbers through the final months of the war. Production continued until Germany's industrial collapse in early 1945. The last Panthers saw combat in the defense of Berlin. Many were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. After the war, the French army operated captured Panthers for several years before retiring them in the early 1950s. Oberst Hans von Luttwitz survived the war. He was never held responsible for the defeat at Arracourt. German military courts understood that he had been following orders and fighting against overwhelming odds. Post-war interviews with von Luttwitz revealed a man who had absorbed the lessons of the battle. He acknowledged that German overconfidence in technological superiority had been a critical error. He noted that the Americans had adapted faster than German intelligence had recognized. The Battle of Arracourt remains a case study in military education programs around the world. It is taught at armor schools and war colleges as an example of how doctrine, tactics, and proper employment of specialized vehicles can overcome technological disadvantages. It demonstrates that victory in armored warfare requires more than the best tanks. It requires the best system. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. Your time and attention are not wasted. Through watching, the memory of those lost in World War II continues. If you wish to help preserve that memory, please subscribe to Silent Battlefield. The farmers around Arracourt returned to their fields in October 1944 after the battle ended. They found the landscape littered with destroyed tanks, both German and American. Some of the wrecks burned for days. The French authorities organized salvage crews to remove the vehicles and bury the dead. In the small cemetery at Arracourt, there are graves for German and American soldiers who died in the fighting. The headstones are simple. Most bear only a name, rank, and date. The local French community maintains the cemetery. Every year on September 19th, a small ceremony is held to remember the battle. The irony of Arracourt is profound. The Germans had designed and built what many historians consider the finest medium tank of World War II. They had trained crews in its employment. They had developed tactics to maximize its advantages. And then they sent those magnificent machines into a battle where all those advantages were systematically negated by an enemy who refused to fight on German terms. The Americans had acknowledged their technological inferiority. They knew the Sherman couldn't match the Panther in a fair fight. So they didn't fight fair. They brought specialized tank killers, positioned them intelligently, and fought a mobile, opportunistic battle that exploited German weaknesses rather than confronting German strengths. This was the American way of war in 1944. It wasn't about honor or fair combat. It was about winning efficiently with the tools available. The tank-destroyer doctrine, despite its critics, had provided exactly the tool needed to defeat German armor when properly employed. The Battle of Arracourt changed how both armies thought about armored warfare. For the Germans, it was another piece of evidence that the war was unwinnable. Superior equipment could not overcome Allied material superiority, tactical flexibility, and air dominance. For the Americans, it was validation that combined arms doctrine and specialized vehicles could defeat even the best enemy tanks. The legacy of Aricort extends beyond World War II. Modern armies still debate the proper role of specialized tank destroyers versus main battle tanks. The American military eventually abandoned the tank-destroyer concept in favor of more heavily armed and armored medium tanks, but the tactical lessons mobility, positioning, combined arms remain relevant. The men who fought at Arracourt, German and American alike, were professionals doing their jobs under impossible conditions. The German tankers believed in their machines and their training. They advanced into fire because orders demanded it. The American tank destroyer crews waited in concealment and fired when tactical conditions were optimal. Both sides were trying to survive and complete their missions. War is not about technology. War is about systems, training, doctrine, leadership, and the courage to execute under fire. At Arracourt, the American system functioned better than the German system. That is why the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion destroyed 39 Panthers while losing a handful of vehicles. That is why Oberst von Luttwitz withdrew in defeat despite commanding superior tanks. That is why the 5th Panzer Army's counteroffensive failed. The farmers of Lorraine still plow the fields where the battle was fought. Occasionally they unearth pieces of twisted metal, remnants of tanks destroyed 80 years ago. The land has healed. The scars are buried. But the lessons remain for those willing to study them. In warfare, assumptions are dangerous. The assumption that one's own technology is superior can be fatal. The assumption that the enemy will fight according to your preferred tactics can be deadly. The Germans assumed both, and at Arracourt they paid the price. The American victory was not inevitable. It required preparation, intelligence, aggressive leadership, and skilled crews executing complex tactics under fire. It required a willingness to develop unconventional solutions to tactical problems. It required recognizing that sometimes the answer to, how do we beat their tanks, is not build better tanks, but change how we fight. This is the story that history nearly forgot. Arracourt was overshadowed by larger battles, more famous commanders, more dramatic turning points. But to the men who fought there, it was everything. To the crews of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, it was validation of their training and doctrine. To the survivors of the 113th Panzer Brigade, it was a bitter lesson about the limits of technological superiority. The numbers tell part of the story. Over 100 German tanks destroyed, minimal American losses, a 10-to-1 kill ratio. But numbers cannot capture the psychological impact of watching invincible Panthers burn, of realizing that every assumption about American inferiority was wrong, of understanding that the tide had turned and would not turn back. Oberst von Luttwitz thought he was facing junk. He believed German engineering had won before the first shot was fired. Then he faced 5 tank destroyers at Arracourt, and his certainty died along with his Panthers. That is the story. That is the lesson. And that is what we must remember. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. Your time and attention are not wasted. Through watching, the memory of those lost in World War II continues. If you wish to help preserve that memory, please subscribe to Silent Battlefield.